Okay, so JLL, you fairly recently published your Q1 2025 EMEA Data Centres Report. And I guess one of the eye-catching things was it real that there's been a drop in activity across the core markets. Any sort of thoughts as to why that might be? Because obviously, overall, we think of the industry as being quite buoyant, should we say?
Yeah, thanks, Will, for the first question. Look, the market is certainly still very buoyant. That hasn't changed. I think perhaps what that report is identifying is that transactions in Q1 didn't achieve the levels that they did in, say, the previous year's first quarter of the year. That doesn't mean that activity had slowed down. Far, far from it. I would say that buoyancy you mentioned is very prevalent, but there were a number of market characteristics that have perhaps contributed to a relatively quiet transactional first quarter on leasing. Not least the slowdown or the pause. I would call it a pause in uptake from some of the market makers out there that are reassessing their strategy around market requirements. And when I say market requirements, I don't mean they're reassessing the demand that they have for those requirements, but more akin to the types of requirements that are coming forward now in terms of densities of compute capabilities. You look at NVIDIA's announcements around the chip improvements that have been made over the next sort of couple of years with things like the NVIDIA Rubin Ultra chipset that reportedly will hit 650 kilowatts per rack. Things of that nature have a profound impact on the cooling within a data center, and how you keep that sort of power in relatively small rack areas cooled. It has an implication on how you distribute power to those racks within the data center, but also probably just as critically, how you utilize the power from the grid, where you can see very sharp spikes and both upwards and downwards in power utilization in the milliseconds that potentially has impact on grid infrastructure. And thirdly, from a design point of view, how you interconnect multiples of those racks together in a way that enables them to be optimized and utilized in the most optimal fashion, performance from a performance rating perspective. So I think there's a bit of a pause in looking at how data centers are going to get designed in the future. Would you want to be sinking potentially billions of dollars into a leased data center that today looks fit for purpose, but in 3 years' time, perhaps the design isn't fit for purpose? So there's certainly a revisiting of design in some of the market maker strategies. Combined into that, though, as well, some of the challenges around the actual supply chains. The supply chain, it's a bit of an old story now, and it was certainly impinged during COVID, getting raw materials to construction sites, but that hasn't yet seen its way back to enabling construction at the same rate as we were seeing pre-COVID. So I think there's a combination of factors as to why we've seen a slowdown in transactions actually getting completed in Q1. But as I said at the beginning, the actual level and the buoyancy of the market hasn't dissipated.
Okay, so it sounds like the folks are trying to get their brains around what AI means for the future data centers. And in terms of some of the other challenges you've sort of identified in the report, I was going to say tariffs, but I guess we can't ignore the events of the weekend as well. So I guess geopolitical instability, if we give it the sort of the wider name, that's having some impact on data center sort of planning as well. Is that a reasonable observation?
I think it's a reasonable observation. I am not entirely sure, and be under no illusion here, geopolitical events do have an impact on business, period, not just the data center industry. However, I'm struggling to think of a period in history over the pre-industrial revolution where societies, in society in the UK, societies on a global reach level, haven't had that uncertainty, haven't had volatility, haven't had challenges facing it. Yes, the challenges are certainly ones that can't be ignored, but across the world, business has always risen to those challenges, and the level of demand for the digital economy, the growth of the digital economy globally hasn't slowed down because of those challenges. If anything, you might argue it's actually increased. It's a matter of how and where you deploy your digital infrastructure, perhaps, that is impacted. So, without naming countries specifically, but in the Middle East right now, would you want to be deploying significant capital into a region where there is war going on? The answer's, from a data center perspective, no. But does that mean that you're not building in a plan, a strategy for when those circumstances change? Of course, the big companies are, and that will continue to be the case, moving forward. So, yes, it has had an impact. It is having an impact, but these are impacts that we've always had to deal with in the data center industry and other industries.
No, fair enough. And I guess power constraints is maybe a similar situation in that I think there's always been an element of worry about whether there's enough power to go round. Is that situation getting noticeably worse? I mean, I was at an event, I can't remember, a couple of months ago where the graph showing sort of promised capacity as opposed to power availability, there was a widening gap between the two, but because obviously people are buying well in advance, it hasn't hit reality. But just your thoughts, I suppose, as to how critical that power constraint aspect is becoming.
Well, without power, data centers don't operate. It's as simple as that. In my mind, I like to think of things as not overly complicated topics of conversation. Power constraints are still and will continue to be, for the foreseeable future, a challenge that has to be addressed within the core major sort of flat D markets, the Frankfurts, the Londons, the Amsterdams, the Parises, the Dublins of this European landscape, if you will. But what we've seen as a result of that is other marketplaces getting attention as well. Now, I've always presented and argued quite strongly that the flat D markets are not the only markets within the European sort of construct, if you will, that are important for digital growth. Every country out there is every government out there is trying to understand how it can enable its country to benefit from a digital economy ever more so. So, but the constraints that exist within the flat D have certainly opened up interest and execution of that interest into what some refer as tier 2 marketplaces. I prefer them to describe them as growth market opportunity areas, like those in Italy, Milan, those in Spain, Madrid, and elsewhere. So you've certainly, as a result of the power constraints, had some of the efforts refocusing towards new marketplaces, and that I'm grateful for in some way. But equally, in those major flat D marketplaces, there is still demand. We're starting to see, and it's in the public domain, companies like AWS, companies like Microsoft, companies like Google, all the major market players looking at secondary tier 2 country areas to build capacity into, and some of that certainly will have been driven by the constraints around, say, London. So if you look at the northeast of the UK, if you look towards the Swindon, Didcot, Bracknell sort of areas, you're seeing data center developments there as well. But also, I think it's not just the power constraints around the London marketplace, it's also the design and the requirement in some cases to have additional resilience within their platforms, if you will. So instead of just solely being reliant on the London data center scene to provide the whole of the UK's digital infrastructure out of, from a sort of a cloud perspective, looking at new marketplaces within the UK that can augment that continued demand that we're seeing coming through. Does that answer the question in a broad sort of sense?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And I mean, the next point, I suppose, is a plus and a minus, maybe. So, demand is continuing to outstrip supply. So that's maybe a worry for folks, who want data center space. But I guess for those people building data centers, you put it the other way, it's a huge development pipeline, where there's opportunity. So just your thoughts as to the two sides of that coin, if you like.
Yeah, it, it's a challenge. I like to think of things as opportunities as opposed to problems. And so it's certainly an opportunity for the operator market, the developer marketplace, to try and provide new options for schemes in new locations, as well as in those core locations as well. Anything that can be found in, say, I'm going to just use the UK for this conversation, but it kind of copies and pastes into other key marketplaces. Anything that can be found around London with power or can have a power solution demonstrated to a particular scheme will always gain significant interest and value from the operator and the market makers of this world. But it's also, as I said earlier, expanding the location options as well, outside of just being London. That at the moment appears to be primarily driven by those market makers, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons, Oracles of this world, the big players, as opposed to being led by the operator marketplace. And I think that might be one of the observations as well, worth just pivoting towards a little bit, that historically, the way that the major market players have expanded in and across Europe has been through a delivery coming via the operators of data centers. Building them their own data centers to suit their own requirements has been less prevalent, with a couple of exceptions in European terms. But in the UK, certainly, it's been an operator-driven land and expand strategy. And what I think the dynamics we've just been discussing have encouraged is a desire and an execution by the market makers to start finding their own schemes, their own sites, to start building to suit their own requirements and taking control of that destiny to some degree themselves. That's not to say that if one of the cloud providers, market makers, starts building a new zone region up in the northeast of the UK, it's not to say that that won't then attract, like a magnet, operators to provide alternatives to a market maker's data center campus. Indeed, I expect it will, but the driver in that case will be the market maker being in the northeast, as opposed to one of the operators going to the northeast and a market maker following them up there. There's a good example up in Blythe where there is a significant opportunity for a operator to build a data center up there, but as of yet, we're not aware, and this may have changed, but we're not aware that there's actually any market maker interest. And when I say market maker, it's instead of the word hyperscaler, because everybody's used to that hyperscaler sort of word in our industry. I get that, but they're software companies ultimately. They're not data center companies. Data centers enable their businesses, and therefore I'm tending to use the word market makers because people do follow them, people do take their lead, people take their instruction, and that sort of scheme up in the northeast in Blythe as yet hasn't been able to attract that interest. I do apologise. Let me just hang up that call. That hasn't been able to attract that interest, and yet we know, and it is in the media, I can't mention the company name, but it is in the media, that one of the major market makers has secured sites in the northeast themselves to build their own data centres.
Yeah, and do you think, just to sort of follow up that point, do you think the market makers are more interested in their own facilities because of what we've already discussed about AI? They maybe don't trust the third parties to the same extent, because we know a lot of those market makers you discussed are developing their own liquid cooling solutions, etc. So they think it's sufficiently important for them to sort of have control over more of the process. Is that what's driving it?
There is certainly an element of control of the process. I wouldn't dispute that. I also think there's an element of wishing to come up with their own snagging list first of all. So instead of putting the reliance on what is their critical infrastructure that enables their business success onto an operator when it is untried and untested at this point in time, I get the sense that they perhaps prefer doing it themselves in the first instance, so that they can come up with a solution that works for them. They can see where the challenges are, and then, in order to enable their continued rapid expansion of their businesses, bringing in trusted suppliers, trusted operators, sharing with them their experiences, their lessons, their designs, so that the operator market can then build operational data centers that meet their future requirements, as opposed to just applying old designs and old technologies, or guessing at how it might work. I wouldn't want to be an operator guessing at how best to design and execute that design without the inputs from the market makers, quite frankly. So it's not one or the other. I think it's a sequential thing here, though, not doing them in parallel. But as soon as a market maker is comfortable with the design, I would be very surprised if they didn't start sharing that with their trusted developers and operators to enable their continued expansion and growth within their world.
Okay, and a couple of other things of note. I think the sector observation that despite what's going on in the world, etc., there's great economic resilience within the data center sector. And also maybe slightly separate, but ask it anyway, pre-leasing seems to be the sort of default route to the market. So just your sort of thoughts or observations on those two sort of findings.
Yeah, so pre-leasing first off the bat, if you rewound the clock 5 years ago, was limited. There was always some pre-leasing. Today, I think it's a consideration of the high barrier to entry in the high, which is capex. It's a expensive business to be in, and you don't want to be building a data center that may be costing you 100, 200, 3, 5, $1 billion in capex without a level of certainty behind who's going to be using that from an operator's perspective. So it's been, in my mind, a natural progression in many ways, and we're certainly seeing, not just sort of 2 gigawatts of land bank capability capacity within the UK marketplace, but we're seeing an ever increasing level of pre-lease agreements being put in place. Last year being the most ever. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was the biggest year on record, I believe. From a resilience point of view, yes. I mean, this sector, I've been in it now for 15 plus years. And I rewind the clock to, the financial crash was, let's say, 2008-9. If you look back at the stock prices of the likes of Equinix back then, or Digital Realty back then, and you look at what happened to them when the stock markets collapsed, guess what? So did they. Nobody was immune to that drop back in the financial crash. But the market for data centers, the value in data center stocks was the fastest to rise back to where it was pre-market crash. And fast forward to COVID, again, another global issue that we all had to contend with. The markets took a hard hit at that same juncture, but the data center industry, once again, for different reasons, I would suggest this time round, bounced back very, very quickly. In that particular situation, I think, because all of a sudden we were doing this a lot more, quite frankly, and digital transfer of data suddenly became the way that we continued our businesses to operate. So it is a resilient sector on a global level. Yeah.
And I mean, you've already referenced flat D and whether we call them secondary, tier 2, or your example growth markets, which I like as well. Just your thoughts, I suppose, as to the balance between the two. Maybe throwing sustainability. That's the Nordics is obviously quite exciting area. So just your thoughts. I mean, the flat D markets, are they ever going to use their dominance because they're too expensive and too crowded and not enough power, or you just think people will always want to be in the financial centres, stroke capital cities, but just as opposed to these growth opportunities, if you like?
So lots to unpack there, Phil.
Right, yes.
I'm going to pick on the Nordics first of all, because the Nordic region has been a very successful data center marketplace for as long as I've been in this industry, quite frankly. It's always been seen as a very sustainable, very green marketplace with a lot of available power, a lot of land. What it lacks in terms of population and GDP density, let's say, it certainly makes up for in those other characteristics, and that continues to be the case. But the Nordic region provides a certain type of compute, a certain type of amount of power for compute and storage. The flat D marketplaces have and will continue for the foreseeable future, will be the major GDP generating countries, are the major financial marketplaces across Europe. From a digital point of view, we all use a lot of digital products, and our governments use a lot of digital technology to enable, whether it's university applications or whether it's booking a doctor's appointment or putting a prescription. There's a huge amount of creation of value within digital infrastructure within the flat D marketplaces that isn't going to dissipate anytime soon. That all being said, there are plenty of European countries, and last year we undertook a report for a major European institution that looked at the 27 European member states and their maturity of the data center industries within those countries, and other variables such as GDP, such as population, such as education, a whole bunch of variables. And the conclusion was quite straightforward. There are a number of countries within Europe, and I'll name a few of them, but not exclusively these ones, whose maturity in the data center industry is behind where their aspirations are from a governmental digital platform perspective. Countries like Hungary, countries like Romania, countries like Poland, which is certainly now playing in this space, countries like Portugal. So there are a number of countries that are on that accelerated curve line trajectory that we're now interestingly starting to see interest within the data center industry, because without a data center, you struggle. You can't just be solely reliant on the data center across the border in Germany or in France or in the UK or somewhere. The UK, obviously, a slightly different situation now outside of the European Union. Countries themselves need to have a digital basis, a digital infrastructure, for a whole host of reasons. And our expectation is that in alignment with the major markets and the Nordics, you're going to see growth in some of these new emerging marketplaces in Europe as sort of everyday business effectively. So, yeah, it's a resilient marketplace. There's growth across the whole of Europe. It isn't just a flat D phenomenon, the data center industry, but some of those markets have got further to go than others.
Okay, and then sort of arriving near the end, I just back to, I mean, I can't avoid asking the sort of supply and demand. The industry is very good at being positive about these things, but I mean, as I say, all the predictions are, if not scary, are, some cause for alarm. I mean, do you think there will be at some point a significant bottleneck because, whether it's governments aren't building out the infrastructure, the power, renewing the power infrastructure, etc., or will the industry, as it's already doing, build its own, etc., and get round the problem? Or can you see a time when, there's 30 data center projects just waiting for the power to become available? Like in the UK, I'm aware of housing developments that are, as far as I'm aware, are not being built because there's not enough power. So presumably data centers aren't immune. Sorry to go on a bit, but just your thoughts as to that sort of landscape, if you like.
We're in an industry that has consistently, and past behaviors and successes are not a future predictor, but we're in a sector that's been very good at managing to support the demand that's coming through with supply. It feels very constrained at the moment. It certainly feels that way. But we do historically, and for the foreseeable sort of 3 to 5 year period, we do seem more than capable of coming up with some creative ways of providing the necessary elements including power and fiber and land, to enable that demand to be met. Bottlenecks already exist, I would suggest. Could the Frankfurt marketplace do with an additional 200 megawatts of power available in 2 years' time? Absolutely, yes. Would that be utilized by this industry? Absolutely, yes. I'm convinced of that sort of broad brush statement. However, without that 200 megawatts, does that mean that the digital economy of Germany is going to slow down? No. Why? Because other marketplaces are picking up some of that extra requirement, like the Berlin marketplace and others in Germany that we're aware of that aren't in the public domain yet. So we're a creative, and by the way, even in Frankfurt, there are some projects coming through that weren't there 12 months ago, on the drawing board either. So it's not that Frankfurt isn't coming up with creative, alternative, or new data center schemes. It is, or London copy paste that statement, but it is a challenging marketplace. It's not. I think the biggest challenge to the sector is the continued demand that's being placed on it. We continue. Humanity continues to generate more and more and more data. AI comes along, and it creates more data. It comes up with new products, new services, new product offerings that we haven't even thought about just yet today. And there's certainly plenty of new products out there that have come onto the market in the last 12 months, let alone what's about to come down the pipeline. So the demand isn't going to subside. Therefore, we're going to have to continue being creative within this sector. We've demonstrated that ability, and I know in our pre-call sort of exchange of emails, SMRs was mentioned as a possible answer to some of that power constraint issue. It is. It's certainly one that's on the agenda of everybody out there, but it's also probably at least 7 years away. I'd love to be wrong with that statement. I'd love it to be 3 years away, but that certainly won't be the case. There's other technological changes and improvements that we've mentioned at the very beginning, the improvements that companies like NVIDIA are launching with new chipsets that will enable more compute power in arguably smaller locations. 650 kilowatts today is going to take you, arguably, let's say 120, 130 racks to deliver that. Actually, it's probably not fair. Let's say 50 racks to deliver that 650 kilowatts. If in 2 years' time you can deliver that 650 kilowatts in, let's just arguably say the same amount of space as 3 racks, all of a sudden you can densify a data center, a new data center. You might even be able to refit and refurbish an old data center with a cooling, fiber, and transmission power distribution design that enables you to use a 5 megawatt data center as it is today. If you can get the power into it, it might suddenly be a 50 megawatt data center. So there's lots of things out there that people are trying to get their heads around to enable and to make sure that ongoing torrent of demand is satisfiable.
Okay, and one final question, which may or may not make sense, and I don't know whether the report covered it or just sort of anecdotally. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I don't know whether everyone else is, but you just assume that everyone building data centers kind of knows what they're doing, and it's great to have all this new capacity. But are you aware of companies that are better at doing this kind of thing than others? Hence, if there are still enterprise people that are wanting to book space in codes, which I expect there are, they still need to be savvy or understand what it is they're getting into, or can you safely assume that anyone who's building a data center and wants you to come along has done a pretty good job? Or just your thoughts there.
This is not an industry for the light-hearted. That would be my first statement. There are plenty of good operators out there that have learnt through mistakes how and what they need to do in order to deliver a phenomenally good product to the industry, a good data center. Coming into this sector as a newbie is not a walk in the park. That being said, there are a number of new operators that are backed by sustainable, large funds and reputable funds. And some of those will fail and some of them will succeed. The ones that will succeed will be those that have got tried and tested teams of people, starting off at that very senior level, all the way to the operational level, if they're becoming a data center operator, that are tried and trusted people within the industry. So the ones that I think will fail are those that don't have that level of credentials behind them. And I'm not just talking about a CEO that's been in the industry for 20 years. I'm talking about the whole of the team needing to be able to demonstrate that they know what they're doing. What that situation most likely will create is assets, companies that will trade. So the ones that are failing may have done a really good job finding some good sites. For example, they may have just failed at that hurdle of securing an anchor tenant because they don't have the credentials that satisfy the requirements of one of the market makers. That company's got some value behind it. I could anticipate some of those companies actually still, being useful and therefore getting acquired. Some of those successful startups also, I think, will come to the market with a slightly different valuation associated to them versus just being a land banked product to a operational product that have successfully been able to acquire a market maker or several market makers into some of their data centers. That creates a different product, which again, I think will within 5 to 7 years get sold off into the marketplace. In terms of the existing operators, my last statement about reputation, there are certain operators that are out there that have consistently delivered on their promises. There are some others that haven't, have sometimes committed and delivered, and sometimes have committed and under-delivered. So the market makers know who those players are. And I think, but I don't know, I think if you were to give weighting when they're looking at who to do a pre-lease with, I think those credentials are going to be very important as well. So who are their favoured 3, their favoured 5 operators in the marketplace? And the others will struggle to secure some of those large long-term pre-lease agreements.
Okay, I mean, you've opened up a whole new. I was going to maybe ask about the skills shortage, but I think perhaps save that for another day because I've taken plenty of your time, and it's been brilliant to chat to you.
Quick, short one on skills. We need more people.
We need more
in the data center industry, and to be fair, JLL, we're sponsoring. We're running a LEAP program with a number of industry companies that is attracting a diverse range of people to it. We've got our graduate program where every year I have a rotation of at least 4 people through the data center team. We get, next week I've got a young lady joining us on her week from school for her work experience week. If every company in this industry could just do one thing that encouraged one person more to consider the industry, then that would be an improvement forward from where I think we are today. We need, it's a great industry to be in. Talent, once it's in it, recognizes that. 15 years ago, when I got into data centers with Interaction, I wasn't quite sure what it was. Frankly speaking, I'm so glad that David Ruberg offered me the job, because today it's a sector I'm very passionate about and I love it dearly.
No, I'm amazed at the industry. Bear in mind what it did during COVID, for example. Everyone talked about it as the 4th emergency service. You'd have thought that was like an open goal to attract people in there, but for whatever reason, it hasn't matured just yet. But again, thank you so much for your time and great insights into what's going on. So, Tom, appreciate it very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Phil. Nice speaking.